with the battle for control of Congress at stake. Take a look at live images of Palm Beach, Florida right now. A lot of voters having mailed in those ballots, but a lot of people opting to vote in person today. Certainly a scene that we're likely to see throughout the country. We're going to be watching voter turnout very closely here. With Democrats facing several challenges heading into Election Day, President Biden made his final pitch to voters over in New York ahead of Election Day. Take a look.
And election isn't a referendum, it's a choice. It's a choice between two fundamentally different visions of America. I've said from the beginning, my objective when I ran was to build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And I tell you what, it's a fundamental shift, and it's working compared to the mega Republican trickle-down economics.
Let's bring in Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman. And Rick, when we think about the control of House, the control of the Senate, I mean, Democrats have had a very narrow majority there. Any one of these races could tip things over. What's the particular race you're watching today?
Well, I think we know that Republicans are going to win the House. I mean, it would be a complete surprise if Democrats somehow held on to the House. So the question is really about the Senate, and that is going to come down to races in Pennsylvania, Nevada, New Hampshire, and probably Georgia. And those are four cliffhangers, and we are probably not going to know the final outcome by the end of tonight. A couple of those races could be close enough that it's going to take a couple of days to get all the votes counted. It's possible we could end up with a runoff election in Georgia. And it could come down to any one of those races determining who controls the Senate. Now, markets, I think it's safe to say, have priced in divided government, basically because the Republicans seem to have such a large edge in terms of taking the House. That means we're not going to get any more Democrat-only legislation passed during the next 2 years, which means no tax hikes, no big social programs or anything like that. Control of the Senate does matter, though. I mean, one thing that's really important is what President Biden's ability to get political nominees confirmed by the Senate. And one thing that often happens going into the third year of a presidential administration is some of the cabinet secretaries who've been there for 2 years leave. There's some reshuffling of personnel. And if Republicans take the Senate, that is going to have an impact on the type of people President Obama will be able to put into key jobs, and maybe whether he even be able to get people appointed for those key jobs. So that matters. But again, I think markets have priced in divided government for the next 2 years, and that is probably going to be the case.
And Rick, you know, you talked about that potential timeline. I mean, delay. We've come to expect over the last few election cycles that we don't always get the results on the day of. We've already seen some spin on both parties. You know, Republicans, a lot of these MAGA candidates who've come out and said, look, you know, the credibility of the election, of the ballot count sort of at stake. I mean, what are we likely to see in the days ahead? I mean, how should we be looking at how this election is framed, depending on which way it sways?
You know, one of the most interesting new tactics for some Republicans is to basically tell voters ahead of time that if you lose, you will not accept the outcome of the election. But if you win, you will accept the outcome, as if these people are saying there's no way I could plausibly lose. So if that's what the vote shows, then it must be fake. I mean, we should remind people as over and over and over again that there is very, very little evidence of any kind of abnormality in the U.S. electoral system. It actually has been working great. It worked well in 2020, despite what the lies that Donald Trump tells about that. And by all indications, it will work very effectively in 2022. You know, to get deeper, a little bit deeper into the problem, it's really important who wins some of the races, some of these statewide races for jobs such as Secretary of State in a bunch of states, because the Secretary of State is often the person who is in charge of vote counting, and whoever gets elected this year would be in charge of vote counting in 2024. So, and there are a few election deniers who do seem like they have a decent shot, Republicans, of winning those Secretary of State slots. So there's going to be a lot of very interesting stuff to watch in the aftermath of this election that is important for what happens in 2024.
And finally, Rick, you kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, for the Biden administration, sort of concern number one would be depending on which way Congress goes, which way the House goes, the Senate goes, some of those judicial appointments, some other appointments. could be held up. But in terms of the broader Biden agenda, I mean, if this really does go the way the polls suggest, which could be a bit of a red wave, maybe a full-on wave, what does that mean for the next 2 years for this administration?
It means that the Biden administration, it will basically be governing by administrative diktat. I think there's a little bit of a consolation prize here for Democrats because they have gotten a lot of legislation passed during the last 2 years. And it's worth going back and saying the only reason Democrats even had majorities in Congress is because of that runoff election in Georgia in 2020 that went all the way into 2021, January 5th, 2021. Republicans lost both Senate seats in Georgia, and many Republicans say that's because Donald Trump's election lies actually discouraged Republicans from going to vote in the runoff election in Georgia, which took place early in 2021. Democrats should have had a majority in Congress in the first place for the last 2 years. And largely because of that one oddity in Georgia, they were able to pass the infrastructure. Well, first they passed the American Rescue Plan, the huge COVID relief plan early in 2021, then the infrastructure bill last year. Then this year, they got the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which didn't reduce inflation, but include a lot of green energy spending, and also the CHIPS Plus Act. That is a lot of major legislation. So Biden is not going to get any more serious legislation through Congress, except for must-pass spending bills and things like that. But if you just use the first 2 years of his administration, he's got a lot done for a 4-year presidential term. So, like I said, consolation prize for Democrats, but I don't think they're going to feel that way tomorrow morning.
Yeah, and you highlighted the Georgia race. Well, here we are again, right? Talking about a really tight Senate race. That's going to be another interesting one to watch. Rick Newman, as always, thanks so much for that. Kiko.